New Buddha-ware Dhamma Talks. Geoff Hunt presents a talk on some aspect of the Buddha's teaching.
Worry obviously is going to get in the way of meditation, and many of you will have experienced that. And there isn't a person on the planet that doesn't worry. Everybody worries, but they could worry about different things depending on your circumstances. We can define it, but it's a very vague term, but let's try and narrow it down a bit so that we know how to address it. So worry has certain features, as we need to define it in order to be practical about how to attend to it. First of all, worry is generally future-oriented. That is, it's about something that might happen or will happen, could happen. So and secondly, it's a thought process. So it's a future-oriented thought process. What is a thought process? Thinking is very difficult to define, and psychologists have never really come up with a very clear definition. I don't think one can. But in general, you could say that thinking is a stream of verbal and visual imagery, like an inner story that one is telling oneself. But worry is a specific kind of thinking. Worry is thinking. It is this stream of images and words, which is future-oriented. Thirdly, it's pernicious. By pernicious, I mean it is harmful. It is harmful to oneself, and it is harmful to others around you. Why? Well, this word pernicious is quite good, really, because if you're a gardener and you think of certain plants in the garden, like bindweed, which is that white, quite pretty flower, but once you get bindweed in your garden, it's going to start choking off everything else. It's hard to get rid of. Think of worry. It tends to choke off everything else. Think of worry. And that's the key to it, really, at least in the Buddha's teaching, is that it's a form of clinging. It's a particularly harmful, hard to get rid of clinging to a thought process. Only so far now one thing is missing, and that is that it is based on fear. That at the heart of worry is fear, or if you like, anxiety. It's about a threat or a risk, a perceived threat or risk. Whether it's real or not, who knows? Once one starts worrying about something, then a perceived threat or risk that's somewhere lying in the future, waiting to pounce on you, and what worrying is an attempt to solve a problem. It's a problem-solving kind of thinking that is pernicious. It's caught in a loop. So we all know that if we're sometimes trying to sleep and we start worrying, what is going on? It's like that thought process has got into a loop, like a stuck record. Because you might think to yourself, I'm worrying, this is silly, I should stop worrying, right? But then getting out of the loop seems to be very difficult. It takes on a life of its own. It's just going round and round and round and round. If you become mindful of that process itself, I hesitate to say this, but it's actually quite interesting that the mind could work like that. That's locked into some perceived threat. And the threat could be a threat to your identity, your reputation, your property, your relationships. It could be anything. But it'll always be something that's relevant to your personal circumstances and to your culture. That's because, as I say, different cultures, different circumstances, different worries. So there's all kinds of things that people worry about. But what is it that makes it worry is not that it's about, say, debt or whether I can pay my bills. That isn't what makes it worry. What makes it worry is that one is clinging very painfully to a loop of trying to solve a problem which cannot be solved. That's the sad part of it, is that we are trying to solve in thought a problem which cannot be solved in thought. And that's why it goes on, because it's like I'm kidding myself that if I think enough about it, I will find a solution. That's a big assumption. What if I were able to make a leap and say, actually, thought is not going to solve this problem. There's got to be some other way of approaching it. And now there's a way out. Because the fundamental error is to think that any perceived problem, whatever a problem is solvable in thought. False. Completely, perniciously false. Hard to accept, isn't it? Because we are thinking creatures. So we like to believe that if I think something through enough, that I will find a solution or a resolution, at least an optimal resolution. Okay, so how can we approach this in a different way? The origin of the word worry is quite interesting. Actually, I'll just mention this, although I'm not an etymologist, but it's connected with an Old English word, wergen, which means to strangle. But can you see, in a sense, that when you are deeply worrying about something, it's like your mind is being strangled. It's like that loop going round and round is strangling your mind. Because it's pernicious because it's pushing out everything else. When you're worrying, it's hard to deal with anything else at all. So it's a form of strangulation. But who is strangling whom? Who is doing the strangling? Where is the strangling coming from? Is there another little person in you that's bent on destroying you by strangulation? Well, we're allowing it to happen because of a lack of insight, I suppose, into the workings of the self, or what I take to be myself. I need to detach myself to some extent from this notion of what I am, of my own identity. And in doing that, the worrying is then attenuated. It's then softened. Now, no one can totally exclude a tendency to worry from their lives, but you can make a big difference when you start to understand that the problem you are trying to solve through your thought process is not going to be solved that way. Right. Let's look at how to approach this differently then. If it's not going to be solved in thought, how is it going to be solved? Or is it going to be solved at all? Maybe that's part of the problem, is I'm looking for a solution. I think the reason that worry is so pernicious is that it involves the whole of your mind. It involves the whole of your emotion because it's based on anxiety, and it actually involves the whole of your body as well. Your heart rate will go up. These are the physical results of what nowadays we call stress. So when I'm worrying, the whole of this thing I take to be myself is actually engaged. But whenever I try to address it, I think of it only as some sort of intellectual problem that needs to be solved from my thinking about it. And then I don't notice that I can't solve it in thinking, so I think, well, I must do some more thinking. I must do some deeper thinking. I must approach the thinking from a different angle, not noticing that this is a problem that is not solved by thinking. If the whole of the person is involved in this, clinging, this strong, pernicious thinking, then obviously the whole person needs to be engaged in the letting go, the breaking out from that loop. Where do we start with this? Well, we could start in terms of the thinking itself. We could start in terms of, if you like, the emotional, the anxiety part of it, or we could start in terms of the body and what's going on in the body when you're worrying. Possibly the best place to start would be by doing something about the attachment to this loop process of problem solving. Because it's true that I will attach to something out there, or perceived to be out there, such as, can I pay this debt? And then what is happening is that the mind is clinging to something perceived to be outside, which is a threat to it, not noticing that it is the mind that is doing the clinging. What we need to do is to throw it back out there, throw it back out there. Now, this might sound silly, but taken together with the other things I'll say, I think it will work a lot of the time. First of all, just understanding everything I've said so far actually puts a bit of perspective on it, because you realize what it is that's actually going on in you, and that there is no solution not purely thought-based solutions. So the first thing to do is sort of identify, well, what is it that I'm actually worrying about? Right. If it's one of those times when you're trying to get off to sleep or something and this worry is going round and round, what has worked for me in the past is to say, okay, I'm going to get up, get a piece of paper, write down what I think the issue is, and then either park the decision making, that is, that I can't solve the problem because I'm not yet in the circumstances in which I could solve or dissolve the problem. So I park it. In other words, I say, right, at the end of the month or next month, I will return to this because circumstances will have changed, and you could even put it in your diary. All we're trying to do at the moment is just break out of this little loop, right? So I park it, I can park it as it were. I quite like the expression of parking something in your mind by putting it outside there, right? It's in the diary now that I'll return to that on that date. You see, I'm now engaging in a process of detachment because now at least I've the intellectual part of it, I've put it out there in the diary. The other thing, parking and then planning. There's a world of difference between planning something and worrying about it. Planning has no anxiety in it. Worry has anxiety in it. So we've got to convert our worry into a plan. If it's something fairly substantial, like I've got a certain payment coming up which I can't meet, what you can do is plan. Planning is a purely intellectual process. I get the evidence and I get the factors together and I draw up a plan. But while I'm in the state of worry, I may not be able to do that very well. So first of all, I'll park it, and then I'll maybe sketch out a little plan, a worry-free plan, or ask advice from somebody or whatever. Right, now, but this is only the beginning. Because we're trying to divide this up. There's the thinking process part and the false assumption that somehow I can solve the problem, because I perceive it that way, by thinking. Right, now I've put it outside there and I'm turning it into a plan. There is nothing wrong with planning. We all plan. We planned to be here this morning. If there wasn't a schedule that we were following, then we wouldn't be here. So, and I don't worry about it. Why not? Because I've got a plan. And, we've got a timetable for the entire year. So it's all objectified. It's not my head, because if it were only in my head, it could kick off worrying. But since I've planned out the whole thing for the whole of 2016, it's just a plan which I sat there and did coolly. I don't have to worry about it. Remember that this is about anxiety. I've not dealt with the anxiety yet. As soon as I get back in bed, it's going to kick off again, isn't it? Probably. Right? Because the anxiety is still there. Even with the plan, I've not really dealt with the anxiety. How do I deal with it? Well, to be honest, anxiety is fear. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some of us go into denial, that I am actually afraid. It's like saying, I'm a coward. I'm a wimp. Right? Oh, who cares? It is the truth. All of us, all human beings, experience fear. And there isn't a worry that hasn't got fear lurking somewhere underground. It is fear. So how are we going to address fear? Well, you can't really address it intellectually because it's not that kind of thing. One has to, if you like, encourage oneself. By encourage, give oneself courage. Because all the time, the fear is driven by the sense that this is going to overwhelm me, this is going to hurt me, this is going to cause me pain. So one wants to run away, but one can't run away. So you're torn between wanting to run away. If only I could just sneak off and not pay any bills, right? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Just abandon it all, get these fantasies. Yeah, but you can't. So it's still there. All of that is generating and multiplying. Now that is the real source of this loop, is I want to escape, but I can't. It's fear. I'm afraid. But where is this fear? Where does it exist? It is something I am clinging to, that negative premonition of pain coming up. It scares me. And that is what is getting me into the loop, which I'm trying to solve with thought. But thought is not going to solve it, because it's not based on thought, it's based on anxiety and fear. Okay, so once I've done the parking and the planning, or just a sketch of it, I can do a kind of form of meditation. There's a form of meditation in which you can see yourself as very strong. The way to do this is to imagine yourself as not a little wimpy jellyfish, right, that's going to be overwhelmed, but as a rock. As a rock. So you're no longer a person. You're like a rock that can perceive. So like I could be sitting here meditating and I see myself as a rock, as a boulder, as a huge heavy stone that cannot be moved. I cannot be touched by anything. You could do that lying down. You see, what that appeals to your heart, that appeals to the soft part of you. Now you're dealing with anxiety, because now, instead of assuming that I am weak, which is what I'm actually doing, even if I'm not aware of it, I'm now assuming that I am strong. You visualize that you are a rock, you are imperturbable, immovable, untouchable, and everything else is just swimming around you. All kinds of nonsense, which is actually pretty close to reality, isn't it? There's so much sewage swirling around us. And feel it in your body. You could be lying down, you could be standing, whatever it is, and say to yourself, that you could feel yourself as a rock that is completely stable, completely unmovable, that cannot be touched by anything. If you're doing this, because you're worrying as you're going off to sleep, you can find it's actually quite empowering, because a rock can be there for even millions of years. Everything is moving around it. Okay? Whatever goes on, rain, snow, the whole landscape could change from swamp to desert, but still the rock is there. And so you think of yourself as a rock. Now you find that you're really doing this, you're really getting to the heart of what the issue is, because it's not about thinking. It's fear and sense of weakness, of vulnerability. But I'm no longer vulnerable, I'm a rock. And of course, in some ways, we are all a rock. We're certainly made of the same sort of stuff. Right? Where did life come from? It came from dust, from rock. Finally, once you feel you establish that, then you can just go back to your standard thing of just watching the breathing, following the breathing, because now you're giving the mind something to do. You're saying, no, don't get back into that stupid loop over there. Just do the one thing of following the breathing. That's all I'm asking my stupid mind to do, is to follow that breathing. And just remember, there is no problem, and even if there were, it can't be solved in thinking about it, because it's based on fear. It's the fear you have to address, the vulnerability, the feeling of weakness. And just see yourself, that's not me. Why should I be clinging to a sense of myself as weak?
New Buddha Way lets go of East and West and starts afresh in the life we have now. For more information, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.